for whatever reason, to just throw a wrench in this big whole thing and make a big fight when it was absolutely not necessary. So with that, Mr. President, we're going to keep working and see what we can do to bring relief to a lot of this misery. Thank you, and I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President,
The senator from Utah.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, September 17th was an anniversary with double significance for our country. On September 17, 1787, delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, they held their final meeting and signed the Constitution they had crafted. And on September 17, 1986, this body voted unanimously to confirm Justice Antonin Scalia's appointment to the Supreme Court of the United States. Today, 25 years later, he is the senior member of the court. These two events are profoundly related because Justice Scalia is literally helping us rediscover the real Constitution. His approach to doing the work of judges is helping us to rediscover the Constitution that America's founders gave us. The Constitution that is powerful and solid. The Constitution that belongs to the people, protects our rights, limits government, and makes liberty possible. Antonin Scalia was born in Trenton, New Jersey on March 11, 1936. After graduating first in his high school class, valedictorian from Georgetown University and magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, he embarked on a legal career that would include stints in private practice, government service, the legal academy, and finally, the judiciary. President Reagan nominated then-Professor Scalia to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit in July 1982. He appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee on August 4th, 1982, another date with constitutional significance. The hearing began just minutes after the Senate voted 69-31 to approve a balanced budget constitutional amendment, the only time that this body has done so, at least so far. I was an original co-sponsor of that amendment. I mention that because Justice Scalia's approach to the Constitution means that the people and the people alone have authority to change it through the amendment process outlined in the Constitution. The Senate's vote on that balanced budget amendment was part of that process. Professor Scalia told the Judiciary Committee that if he were appointed to the bench, his days of being able to comment on the wisdom of laws enacted by Congress would be, quote, bygone days, unquote. The sense that judges are doing something fundamentally different than private citizens, fundamentally different than legislators, defines his judicial philosophy. The same theme dominated his confirmation hearing 4 years later when President Reagan nominated Judge Scalia to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. As that hearing opened, I quoted from the Chicago Tribune that the nominee was determined, quote, to read the law as it has been enacted by the people's representatives rather than to impose his own preference upon it, unquote. And when Justice Scalia took the oath of judicial office, President Reagan said that the judiciary must be independent and strong, but confined within the boundaries of the written Constitution. Public officials must swear to uphold and defend this written Constitution. It declares itself to be the supreme law of the land. More than 90% of Americans say that it is very important to them. But what exactly is it, and what are judges supposed to do with it? The answer to that question defines Justice Scalia's career and its lasting impact on all of us. The Constitution is a document, the oldest written charter of government in the history of the world. Professor Stephen Calabrese, who teaches at Northwestern University Law School and once clerked for Justice Scalia, writes that when Americans think of liberty, they think of documents, especially of the Constitution. 3 statements at the turn of the 19th century tell us what we need to know. First, the Supreme Court in 1795 literally asked the same question, what is the Constitution? And here's their answer, quote, the Constitution is fixed and certain. It contains the permanent will of the people and is the supreme law of the land. It is paramount to the power of the legislature and can be revoked or altered only by the authority that made it, unquote. Second, President George Washington echoed this theme a year later in his farewell address. He said, quote, the basis of our political systems is the right of the people to make and alter their constitutions of government. But the Constitution, which at any time exists, till changed by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people, is sacredly obligatory upon all, unquote. Third, the Supreme Court, in its 1803 decision Marbury v. Madison, wrote that through the Constitution, the people established certain limits for the federal government, quote, and that those limits may not be mistaken or forgotten, the Constitution is written, unquote. There you have it. The Constitution is the means by which the people express their will and set limits on the government. The people alone have authority to change the Constitution, and until they do, it is fixed and certain. One obvious way to alter the Constitution is to change its words, but a more subtle and even more effective way to alter the Constitution is to change its meaning. Words themselves are just the form, but the meaning of those words is the substance. The real Constitution is its words and their meaning together. Whoever controls the meaning of the Constitution controls the Constitution itself. When we say that only the people may alter the Constitution, that simply must mean that only the people can change the words or their meaning. For the Constitution to be what it is supposed to be, both its words and their meaning must remain fixed and certain until the people choose to change them. Justice Scalia delivered the 1997 Riston Lecture at the Manhattan Institute. Its title was simply On Interpreting the Constitution. He described his topic as, quote, what in the world we think we're doing when we interpret the Constitution of the United States, unquote. This is why it is so important to clarify just what the Constitution is in the first place so that we know what judges are supposed to do with it. Justice Scalia believes that the only proper way to interpret the Constitution is to find the meaning it already has, the meaning given to the Constitution by the people who alone had authority to establish it. Justice Scalia calls this approach originalism. In his Riston Lecture, he said that the Constitution, quote, means what it meant when it was written, unquote. No one is more candid than Justice Scalia that this approach is not easy. But no one is more certain than Justice Scalia that this approach alone is legitimate. This approach alone preserves both the people's control of the Constitution and the Constitution's control of judges. In 2005, Justice Scalia delivered a speech at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars titled Constitutional Interpretation the Old-Fashioned Way. He described originalism as beginning with the text and giving it the meaning that it bore when it was adopted by the people. With all due respect to Justice Scalia, he did not invent this approach, but he is helping us to return to those principles. In his service on the court and his speeches and writings, Justice Scalia is helping us rediscover what America's founders told us to do from the start. I have to emphasize that Justice Scalia has, for 25 years, implemented the very same approach that he described in his hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Vice President Biden was the ranking member at the time, and his very first question was about original meaning as a means of interpreting the Constitution. Justice Scalia explained later in the hearing that the starting point is, quote, the text of the document and what it meant to the society that adopted it. I am clear on the fact that the original meaning is the starting point and the beginning of wisdom, unquote. This body knew that Justice Scalia would take this approach when we unanimously confirmed him, and he has stayed true to his word throughout his judicial career. In addition to instructing us about the principles that we should once again follow, Justice Scalia has been sounding the alarm about failing to do so. He condemns as, quote, power judging, unquote, the modern trend of judges substituting their own constitutional meaning for that of the people. This amends the Constitution as surely as changing its very words. Judges continually find creative ways to mask their power judging. They speak of deeply embedded social or cultural values, evolving standard of decency, and what the Constitution should mean in our time. One of Justice Scalia's former colleagues even said that the Constitution is, quote, a sparkling vision of the supremacy of the human dignity of every individual, unquote. All of these evolving standards and sparkling visions are different ways of saying the same thing. The judges have taken control of the Constitution by controlling what it means. Justice Scalia will have none of it. In a 1996 dissent, he rejected this for what it really is, namely the court's constitution-making process. He wrote, quote, "The court must be living in another world, day by day, case by case. It is busy designing a constitution for a country I do not recognize," unquote. And one of the many things I like about Justice Scalia is that he applies his principles across the board. He has often pointed out that judges amend the Constitution by changing its meaning in ways that liberals like, but also in ways that conservatives like. All of it, he says, is wrong. Judges have no authority to design a new Constitution, no matter what it looks like. Sometimes I wonder how anyone could think otherwise. How could anyone believe that unelected judges may take a Constitution that opens with the words, "We the people," and turn it into something else? Why would anyone tolerate judges who change the very Constitution that judges are supposed to follow? Justice Scalia believes that no one should, and he challenges us to live up to the principles that define our system of government and that make our liberty possible. The real Constitution is solid and fixed. It was established and can be changed only by the people. That Constitution, the real Constitution, is strong enough to limit government and protect liberty. But that Constitution is being replaced by a very different one. Since about the 1930s, the real Constitution controlled by the people has been replaced in some measure by a fake Constitution controlled by judges. The Constitution is weak, pliable, and shifting, according to them. It morphs and modifies. It shivers and it shakes. This Constitution is a figment of the judicial imagination, and it is written in disappearing ink. Thomas Jefferson warned that if judges controlled what the Constitution means, it would become, quote, "a mere thing of wax in the hands of judiciary, which they may twist and shape into any form they please," unquote. Doing so, Jefferson said, would make the Constitution nothing but a blank paper. This is not just an academic exercise. If you think that the latest judicial mood swing is strong enough to limit government, think again. If you think that a lump of wax or a piece of blank paper is firm enough to protect your liberty, think again. A Constitution that can be changed by nothing more than a judge's imagination is no Constitution at all. This struggle over what the Constitution really is affects not only what judges do with it, but also how judges are chosen in the first place. If judges can change the Constitution by changing its meaning, then the judicial selection process will inevitably focus on the Constitution that a judicial nominee is likely to create. It will inevitably focus on the form into which a judicial nominee can be expected to shape and twist the Constitution. Speaking at the State University of New York School of Law in 2002, Justice Scalia warned that if the Constitution's meaning is determined by judges rather than the people, the selection of those judges becomes, quote, "a very political hot potato." Every time you need to appoint a new Supreme Court justice, you are going to have a mini plebiscite on what the Constitution means, unquote. In the 2007 speech at the Jesse Helms Center, Justice Scalia similarly compared the judicial confirmation process to a mini constitutional convention. If judges may write a new Constitution through their rulings, he said, the process will be about finding a nominee who will, quote, "write the Constitution that you want," unquote. Justice Scalia is also affecting how we do things here in the legislative branch. The more that judges are willing to do our work for us, the less of it we are likely to do ourselves. On the other hand, if judges insist that we legislators say what we mean and mean what we say, then we are likely to draft laws differently. The law that we enact, after all, is the text of our statutes and not the speeches, reports, comments, thoughts, or other things that consume the legislative process. Knowing that judges who have to interpret and apply our statutes will look only at the law is an incentive for us to make sure that if it is to be the law, it must be in the statute. That approach is more transparent, more accountable, and more reliable, and we have Justice Scalia to thank for pushing us in that direction. Justice Scalia seems to be the justice that liberals love to hate. If this were a Harry Potter movie, liberals would put Justice Scalia on a wanted poster as undesirable number one. And yet they just can't seem to look away. The principles on which he stands are so compelling, and his way of wielding them so powerful, that whether you love him or hate him, you simply must deal with him. Those who think judges may just make it up as they go along have a hard time figuring Justice Scalia out, because he does not follow their game plan. Only a few months into his first term on the Supreme Court, the Washington Post reported that though Justice Scalia was expected to be a hard-charging conservative, he was voting with liberal Justice William Brennan almost two-thirds of the time. Several weeks later, another Post headline read, "Newest Reagan appointee joins liberals and the percentage of agreement with Justice Brennan seemed to be going up." Conservative George Will's column at the end of the 1985-87 Supreme Court term bore the title, "Good Grief, Scalia." Not to worry, though, because the Post headline just 1 year later read, "Scalia may be successor as conservatives' chief advocate." The real way to know Justice Scalia, you see, is to know his principles. They are principles drawn directly from America's founding, from the nature of limited government under a written Constitution. No one works harder to articulate and apply those principles day in and day out than Justice Scalia. Research in the last several years has demonstrated that he is the funniest justice in oral argument and the most cited in law reviews and journals. His lectures around the country are consistently standing room only. His interview on the University of California's Legally Speaking television program has been viewed at least 6 times as often as any other guest. No doubt some of this popularity, this buzz, comes from his engaging personality, his wit, and his sense of humor. People just enjoy being with a person like him. But it also comes from the substance, the sheer magnitude of the message that he delivers in that unique way. People like a witty, engaging person, but they also respect powerful principles and a message that weighs more than a passing intellectual fad. I have so far spoken today about Justice Scalia, the jurist. I cannot close this tribute, however, without a few comments about Antonin Scalia, the man. The hearing on his Supreme Court nomination 25 years ago took place in the Judiciary Committee's regular hearing room, which is much smaller than where we hold such hearings today. His hearing lasted just 2 days, including testimony by witnesses. I can still remember that Justice Scalia's family occupied more than 1 row in the audience. As Justice Scalia introduced them, including all 9 of his children, he said that, quote, "I think we have a full committee," unquote. Media cameras went crazy every time his youngest daughter, Meg, would lean her head on her mother's shoulder. Meg was just 6 years old then, but as I remember, she held up very well as we lawyers talked about all sorts of jurisprudential minutiae. That sight impressed on me Justice Scalia's deep love for family and the sacrifice that family makes when someone like him is so devoted to public service. He is also a man of deep faith and love for our country and the values on which it was founded. 5 years ago, I marked Justice Scalia's 20th anniversary in a speech here on the Senate floor. At that time, I put into the record letters from some of his former law clerks, and I want to do the same today. I ask consent to place in the record, after my remarks, letters from some of the following former law clerks.
Without objection.
Edward Whalen, who clerked during the October 1991 term and later served as my counsel when I was ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, is now president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Paul Clement, who clerked during the October 1993 term and later served as Solicitor General of the United States, is now a partner in the Bancroft law firm. Mark Phillip, who also clerked during the October 1993 term and later served as a U.S. District Judge, is now a partner at Kirkland & Ellis in Chicago. Brian Fitzpatrick, who clerked during the October 2001 term, is now an associate professor at Vanderbilt Law School. And Brian Killian, who clerked during the October 2007 term, is now an associate at the Bingham McCutcheon law firm here in Washington. In closing, I want to say that all Americans owe Justice Antonin Scalia a deep debt of gratitude. Every day he serves on the Supreme Court, Justice Scalia gives a gift to all of us. He is reintroducing us to the principles and to the document that make our liberties possible. He invites us, in the words of the Kellogg's Corn Flakes commercial, to try it again for the first time. I returned to that scene of his first judicial confirmation hearing in 1982. The constitutional amendment process was underway that day, but it was rightly happening on the Senate floor rather than in the confirmation of a federal judge. Keeping clear the principle that only the people have authority to change the Constitution will give us, as Justice Scalia often puts it, an enduring rather than an evolving Constitution. We must step up and govern ourselves rather than look to judges to do it for us. I hope that we see this opportunity for what it is, following Justice Scalia's lead, grasping again the principles of liberty, and resolving never to let them go. Finally, let me just say one or two words that I'd like to say at the end here. I've been around here a long time. I've had a role with regard to every current member of the United States Supreme Court and a number of those who have gone on. I have to say that one of the most respected men in this country is Justice Scalia. And I count him as a friend. I count him as a mentor. I count him as a teacher and professor. I count him as one of the all-time greatest Supreme Court justices, a man who, without question, is as good a person as you can find. He's a terrific human being. His life has been a life of service to his fellow men and women. His wife is a terrific person. And as far as I know, the kids are all great, too. All I can say is that we've been really fortunate that he's been willing to serve as he has. We are a greatly strengthened country because of Justice Scalia. There are a number of justices in the history of this country to whom we have to look up. He's one of them. I think we should revere all of them, but he's one of the greats. And I suspect that he will be quoted, he will be written about, he will be talked about for a long, long time because of the genuine intellect of the man, the tremendous personality he has, the brilliant mind that we see on display every time he writes an opinion or gives a speech or lectures to us or gives a talk. This is one of the truly great people in our country today. And I don't care whether you're a Democrat or Republican, a liberal or conservative or somewhere else, this is a man we ought to all respect with every fiber of our beings, and his family as well. With that, I yield the floor.
President.
The senator from Oregon.
President, my hope is that we are moving into the home stretch in terms of being able to pass the Trade Adjustment Assistance legislation. I strongly support efforts to promote more exports. The President has set a laudable goal of increasing exports. We know that in the export sector, there's an opportunity to make things here, to grow things here, to add value to them here, and then ship them around the world. And to promote these export markets and to generate the economic growth that our country wants, we've got to make sure that our workers have the latest, most updated skills to make sure that they can get those jobs in exports and get American products around the world. As I indicated yesterday, Madam President, there's no doubt that the American brand is a hit around the world. 90% of the consumers are outside the United States, and they want our products. And my hope is, as I've indicated, that we're moving towards being able to pass this legislation, the Trade Adjustment Assistance, pass legislation to increase our exports. And because some pretty astonishing comments have been made with respect to the Trade Adjustment Assistance program, I want to take just a few minutes this afternoon and make sure that we can get some facts out to combat some of the rhetoric. For example, one comment that I've heard repeatedly is that the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program is a sop to organized labor. The argument here is that trade adjustment assistance is really just a giveaway to labor unions. They're the people that want the program. It's something that is part of the labor priority list. Well, I can tell the President of the Senate, I'm sure she hears the same thing that I hear at home, and that is folks who are members of labor unions don't come up to you and say what they want is the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program. They come up and they say, Senator, what I want to do is have a good-paying job. I want a job where I can support my family, where I've got a living wage. That's what I'm really concerned about right now, Madam President. What I'm concerned about is China, for example, with their low-interest loans. In some areas, like solar manufacturing, where I've written the Obama administration, the Chinese are undercutting our solar manufacturers because they're basically giving out free money now. That's what workers come up to senators and say, is, Senator, I want to have a good job, one I can make sure that when I go to bed at night, I'll know that when I wake up in the morning, I'll be able to support my family. So labor union folks don't walk up and say, this is what I want from you United States Senate folks, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program. And the fact is, it's been documented by Mathematic Policy Research, less than half of the participants in the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program were members of a union. Let me repeat that. Less than half of those who participated in trade adjustment assistance were members of a union. In fact, this is a program that's available to all American workers who qualify. When you're talking about applying, in effect, a trade adjustment assistance petition can be filed by any of the following groups: a group of 3 or more workers, an employer, a labor union, a state workforce official, a one-stop operator or partner, or any other person who is designated a duly authorized representative. Now, this is, to me, the bottom line, Madam President. In 2009, more than 9 out of 10 petitions for trade adjustment assistance relief were filed by non-union firms or groups. And I want to repeat that, Madam President, because we have heard so frequently that this is somehow a giveaway to labor, a sop, to the labor unions. Madam President and colleagues, in 2009, more than 9 out of 10 TAA petitions were filed by non-union firms or groups. More than 2/3 of the eligible population for the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program were not members of a union. So I hope at this point in the debate we can make it clear, we can make it understandable that TAA is not a program only available to labor unions. It is not true that trade adjustment assistance is only available to labor unions. TAA is for all Americans. And for senators who hear as this debate, as I indicated, hopefully moves into the home stretch, I hope they'll remember that in 2009, more than 9 out of 10 TAA petitions were filed by non-union firms or groups. The second area that I wanted to touch on, Madam President, in terms of trying to rebut some of these criticisms about the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program is the argument that there is no need to extend eligibility to those in the service sector. Now, in 2009, the Congress expanded the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program so that service workers that are displaced by trade would be eligible for assistance. Now, there has been criticism of this expansion, and I want to make sure, again, that senators and those who are listening to this debate actually get some of the key facts. Now, it's important to remember that 82% of employment between 2006 and 2010 was in the service sector. And to argue that workers in computer programming, finance, accounting, and insurance do not face foreign competition is just simply to put your head in the sand. A forthcoming paper by Bradford Jensen finds that Americans employed in business and professional services face more international competition than workers in the manufacturing sector. So again, when senators hear this argument that there is no case for extending trade adjustment assistance eligibility to service workers, I hope that they will really think through the implications here of international competition that our workers face in this sector, because those in computer programming, in finance, in accounting, and insurance, those are important workers in the American economy. They played a big role, particularly in the export sector, and I think to just arbitrarily say that they shouldn't be eligible for the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, given what many of them are facing in terms of international competition, just isn't right. Now, the third argument that I'd like to take on directly, Madam President, is the argument that in some way the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program is a special, almost duplicative program. Again, the facts show that this argument doesn't stand up. A Mathematica policy research report from last year makes clear that workers who lose their jobs due to increased imports, surging imports is the way we ought to appropriately characterize it, Madam President. Those folks who are therefore eligible for the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program because of surging imports tend to be older, often have less education, and have higher pre-layoff earnings compared to other unemployed Americans. So that's why the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program is different than the Unemployment Insurance Program. It is tailored to meet the distinct needs of a critical portion of the labor force. The workers are older. Often they have less education. The transition, as the President of the Senate knows, can be gut-wrenching because a lot of these individuals, before their layoffs, were making good wages, and now they're wondering how they're going to be able to get the skills, how they're going to be able to pick up the knowledge to tap the latest opportunities that are available in American business that's looking to export. This is a program that doesn't duplicate any other. It's a program that is designed to serve a unique population. Now, Madam President, I'm sure we're going to continue through the rest of the discussion about trade adjustment assistance to see a lot of back and forth between senators with respect to the merits of the program. I continue to believe that we ought to start, as we analyze it, by remembering that this has always been a bipartisan program, number one. And number two, petitions, TAA petitions, have been approved by labor departments in both Democratic and Republican administrations. This has roots in the bipartisan effort to support expanded trade. One study after another, Madam President, shows that expanded trade, particularly tapping export markets, can generate hundreds of thousands of jobs. But there is no question that as we try to make sure we don't lose a single job in America, even short-term, that some workers can end up needing some help during a transition from one job to another. And if they have been harmed by surging imports, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program is there for them. And that's why we ought to reauthorize it. I think we also ought to recognize that it is knit together with the effort to pass the free trade agreements, because the free trade agreements are about more exports, and to have all the workers we need for the potential export markets, we've got to make sure that workers who've been laid off have a chance to upgrade their skills. We will come back to this topic, I'm certain, Madam President, but I hope that in the last few minutes we've been able to at least offer some concrete, documented facts that make clear that the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program is not a sop to organized labor, since in 2009 the vast majority of those granted relief had nothing to do with a labor union. Second, that we've made the case for why service workers facing very aggressive international competition ought to be eligible for the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program. And third, I hope we've been able to lay out how this program doesn't duplicate any others, because this is a unique group that disproportionately uses the program that's older, often with less education, and the transition can be particularly gut-wrenching because very often they have higher pre-layoff earnings compared to other unemployed Americans. I think we understand, Madam President, that the biggest challenge for this Senate is creating more good-paying jobs. In my state, about 1 out of 6 jobs depends on international trade. The trade jobs tend to pay better than do the non-trade jobs. And that's why I consider it such an honor when Chairman Baucus asked me to chair the subcommittee, the Finance Subcommittee on International Trade, because I saw this as an opportunity to grow the Oregon economy and to grow good-paying family wage jobs. Oregon has a very good record in terms of manufacturing. We face a whole host of dramatic challenges right now, Madam President. For example, I'm particularly concerned about where our country is headed in terms of manufacturing in the renewable energy sector. The Chinese are engaged in very aggressive and, I think, questionable practices with respect to the Chinese Development Bank and the fact that, in effect, they're giving free money to companies who could manufacture and undercut the American market. I've asked the Obama administration to investigate this. If they don't, I'm certainly going to be looking legislatively at pursuing trade remedies. Much of what we're faced with in terms of the renewable energy sector, particularly generating jobs in manufacturing in that sector, deals with making sure that we have a rules-based trading system. We enjoy the fact that China is a trading partner. Our state gets a significant amount of jobs from exporting goods to China. But the Chinese, like everybody else, have to comply with the rules. And there is a substantial amount of evidence that the rules aren't being complied with as it relates to manufacturing in the solar sector. And that's why I'm using my position as chairman of the Trade Subcommittee to get on top of it. We've already lost some solar manufacturers, and we shouldn't sit idly by and lose more. That's the kind of challenge we ought to be working on. We ought to be working on together on a bipartisan basis, Madam President, not coming to the floor of the United States Senate and blocking a piece of legislation that gives our workers an opportunity to get ahead in the private sector, to get ahead in the export market, to be in a position to get the good-paying jobs that are going to be available in the years ahead if we pass legislation to remove trade barriers. The reality is, in virtually all of these areas, Madam President, Our tariffs are low, which means that around the world, countries get to send their products to us and get almost totally free access to our market. And around the world, when we try to ship our products to them, we face very substantial tariffs. That's what we're trying to change here on the floor of the United States Senate, to level the playing field. Because if we level the playing field, Madam President, our workers get more out of it than do the workers of other countries. That, to me, ought to be particularly appealing to United States senators now when our folks are hurting, when there is so much pain in communities across this country. When I'm home, I'm consistently seeing workers who are walking on an economic tightrope, balancing their food bills against their fuel bills and their fuel bills against their medical costs. And they go to bed at night wondering if they're going to have a good-paying job in the morning, given what's being reported every day in the newspaper in terms of layoffs and the kinds of challenges our companies are facing in tough global markets. That's why legislation to promote exports makes sense. It's an opportunity to provide a new measure of economic security to hardworking American families. To tap those export markets, we've got to make sure that our workers, all of our workers, can get the skills and those kinds of opportunities to make sure that they can qualify for those export markets. This legislation, passing trade adjustment assistance, is a key component of our ability to generate more jobs in the private sector through exports. I certainly hope that we are in the home stretch of being able to pass this legislation, move on to the agreements, move on to the opportunity to generate more exports, because that means more work, good-paying work for our people. Madam President, with that, I yield the floor at this time.